We can add new reporting tonight that Mr. Giuliani is also simultaneously the subject of a, quote, very active federal criminal investigation by prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. We can report tonight, according to two sources familiar with the investigation, that federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York have expressed interest in and have discussed the possibility of trying to obtain Mr. Giuliani's electronic communications. Broadly speaking, the federal prosecutors have talked about trying to obtain those communications for a case against Mr. Giuliani that is not just ongoing, it may now be ramping up. Let me just say that one more time, because this is breaking news. Federal prosecutors have expressed interest in and the possibility of taking the extraordinary step of obtaining Rudy Giuliani's electronic communications for an ongoing and perhaps accelerating federal criminal investigation of Mr. Giuliani. Now, whether prosecutors would take that step of accessing his electronic communications by way of asking a court for a search warrant, or by asking a grand jury to subpoena the records, we don't know. Either of those are potential avenues for federal prosecutors seeking access to these kinds of materials. Now, we've been reporting this story with our colleagues at NBC News. They have just posted their story about this matter online at NBCnews.com. But one of our sources tonight tells us that this case at SDNY involving Mr. Giuliani is, quote, very active. Neither SDNY nor Maine Justice would comment for this story. But it's important to note, as a matter of context, that federal prosecutors in SDNY, federal prosecutors in New York, can't move forward. They can't ask a judge for a search warrant in a case like this without at least some level of approval from higher-ups at the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. I mean, first of all, since Mr. Giuliani is a lawyer, and he plays one on TV, prosecutors always have to take special precautions to ensure that they're not improperly accessing any of his correspondence that is protected by attorney-client privilege. And that's a sort of standard permission structure that prosecutors need to go through because of the sensitivity of protecting the legal process. But also, of course, elephant in the room here, Mr. Giuliani is not just a random lawyer, he is a lawyer for the president. And so that is an undoubtedly sensitive matter that Maine Justice would result in Maine Justice likely having a hand in decisions about in terms of opening a case or taking new investigatory steps against someone in that kind of a position, let alone the possibility of ultimately charging or potentially arresting such a person. You would expect Maine Justice to have some hand, some level of awareness at least about what line prosecutors were doing at a U.S. Attorney's office when it came to somebody like that. Now, we do not know the exact timing of the discussions within the federal prosecutor's office in New York about asking a judge or a grand jury to obtain Mr. Giuliani's electronic communications. We do not know whether prosecutors in New York have gotten the green light from Maine Justice to do this. But we can report that they have been in communication about this with the brass in D.C. And that, again, is because the case at SDNY right now is considered to be very active. If any of the prosecutors or justice officials involved were previously, at an earlier stage in this investigation, holding back on allowing any new investigative steps involving Mr. Giuliani because of his relationship to the president, because of the worry specifically that such steps could conceivably have an influence on the presidential election, and therefore they should be delayed. That's Justice Department policy, right? Not to take investigative steps. It's more complicated than this, but basically don't do stuff ahead of an election that might influence the election. This is what James Comey has been rightfully raked over the coals for as an FBI director who took steps that very much influenced the election in 2016. It is Justice Department policy that that shouldn't happen. If that was driving any potential concern about taking these steps with Mr. Giuliani, those concerns would no longer be operative, right? Any worry along those lines of potentially influencing the election, that would now be over because the election is 7 weeks behind us as of tomorrow.